My name is Larry Garfield. Thank you for having me here. You can stalk me online at krill@phpc.social. That's the PHP Mastodon server. I've given up on the site formerly known as Twitter. I'm a staff engineer for LegalZoom. We're a US company that does business automation, essentially. So if you want to start a business, we take care of the paperwork for you. I'm also a longtime member of the PHP Fig core committee. Fig is kind of PHP's user space standards body. General purpose pedant, and I've written a couple of books, which I still recommend. Okay. But enough about me. Let's talk about PHP. Actually, before I continue, who has been using PHP since PHP 8.0 came out? Okay, who remembers PHP 7? Who remembers PHP 5?
5.4.
Okay, so a lot of people here have been around a while. This is good because you'll recognize this disaster. This is how we used to write classes in PHP. We'd have properties that we defined, and we have a constructor that sets those properties, and we have a getter for each property and a setter for each property, and we'd have a doc block on each one that specifies what the return type or parameter type is supposed to be, which may or may not be accurate at any given time. Who knows? And we would have 50, 60 lines of this boilerplate getter and setter logic. That's gross, but this was life in PHP 5. Let's just look at one property for now so we can watch the evolution. So we get into all this work, and we still have basically no type safety. We have no safety at all aside from methods that don't do anything. That began to change with PHP 7. In PHP 7, we got the ability to have typed parameters and return values. This is cool. We can now put our types directly in the syntax. You could only do it for classes before. Now we can do it for basically anything. And this will get enforced. So the doc block went out of date. Doesn't matter. This won't go out of date. If it goes out of date, the code will break and your tests will catch it. Because we're all writing tests, right? Right?
Right.
Right, good. It also means that we get rid of a whole bunch of lines of code that are just documenting things that now the code itself says for us. In 7.4, we got our next improvement with types on properties. This is fantastic for all the same reasons. It's now self-enforcing. We know and can guarantee the type that we're going to have out of these properties. So we know everything's going to line up properly. With 8.0, it got even shorter. We got constructor property promotion. So instead of typing public string first name equals first name, we could just type it once and we're done. This is huge. Honestly, this is the biggest improvement in PHP 8. 8.0 was a fantastic release, had a lot of cool stuff. This is the thing that had the biggest impact, quite frankly. So this is cool. 8.1 came along and gave us read-only properties. So we have a choice at this point. We can have a class that just has a bunch of public properties and then read and write to them, and we have no methods. Or we can make it read-only and have public properties that we can guarantee won't change after they get set. This is really nice. Usually, it's still iffy to do the first one because, well, this means that you can change any of these values at any time from anywhere, including outside the class, which is not fantastic. So, and besides, if you wanted to do this, then what happens if you want to put some additional enforcement on this property? Well, you can't just do it in the constructor because it could be set from other places. So if you want to add some, like a length enforcement on the first name, you kind of have to add a method back. Make the property private, have a method now that does our checking. And since it's a private property, we now need to have a public method to get it. So we're back to having a whole bunch of boilerplate. And we just broke the API. Formerly, you could just read first name directly. Now you have to go through a method. And great, because you wanted to add validation, you just broke your all of your consumer's code. If you want to not break your code, well, we can use the magic methods, underscore underscore get and underscore underscore set, and now change the name to underscore first name to indicate it's for reals private, and then call get and set, which get called dynamically for anything that you access that doesn't actually exist. And then we have to do everything ourselves, including the type evaluation. And if we're accessing more than one property, this gets hideous and disgusting very, very quickly. Please do not do this. If you're using the magic get and set methods, 80% chance you're doing something wrong. 10% chance you're doing something iffy that is probably wrong. So avoid this. It's also much slower. Calling get and set methods are actually quite slow, relatively speaking. Which means that to avoid this, the state of the art in PHP today, even up through 8.3, is this. We have a bunch of private properties that we only type once, but then we still have these wrapper methods around them, just in case we want to do something with them. These methods do not do anything for us other than be a place we could put logic in later if we wanted to. So in a 3-property class, we have 6 additional methods, each of which is going to be 4 lines in the IDE if we're formatting it properly. And so we've now got 3 screens worth of pointless code, just in case we want to change something later. This is awful. We can do better. Better is PHP 8.4, where we can now do this. Instead of writing a method, we can now declare a property and a set hook, a piece of code that gets injected in between the code that calls sets and the actual property right itself. And we can do whatever we want in there. You get all of the benefits of using magic set and magic get with none of the downsides. You can still read this property anywhere, but you can't write to it with something that is an empty string. So it is guaranteed to actually have a non-empty value now. So what does that mean? It means hooks are a feature you benefit from without using. The point of hooks is to not use them, but know that you can use them later if you need to, and it won't be an API break. What this means is we don't need all those methods. Of course, you can also think of hooks as an alternative way of doing methods. We'll see some examples of that, but it kind of makes that transparent. So let's look at what hooks actually are now. We've got a property. So this is a basic class with a public property on it. We can read to it, or read from it. We can write to it. Cool. Instead of putting a semicolon after it, we can now put curly braces. Under the curly braces go additional hooks. And we can have a get hook or a set hook, or both. These hooks intercept the read-write process and override whatever the normal behavior would have been for a normal property. The body of these hooks is a method. It works exactly the same as a method, essentially. This is the body that would have been in the get and set methods, but we now don't need a method. We can just put it straight on the property, which means that nothing has changed in the API. If you look down at the bottom, we read and write from the property the same as before. If you don't want to have to respecify the property type, then you can omit the type and name from the set argument. In fact, you usually should. If you don't specify a name, then the incoming value defaults to the name value. This is a new special variable name, similar to this, but it only means something inside of a get hook or a set hook. Actually, excuse me, just inside of a set hook. Why value? Because that's what C# and Kotlin use for basically the exact same functionality, because they have the same logic, the same capabilities as does Swift. This design is mostly borrowed from Kotlin. If we want things to be a little less verbose, we can also shorten a get hook. If our get hook is a a single expression, then just like a short closure or short lambda or an arrow function, all the same thing, we can just say get arrow some expression, and it'll return the value. Inside these hooks, when we refer to this name, that's referring to the underlying stored value. You can also shorten the set hook. In this case, what's returned from the set hook will get set as the underlying property. If you are not using the shorthand, then you have to set it yourself. We'll see a reason why in a little bit. None of the code we've seen so far changes the behavior in any way. This is just showing the skeleton of how the hooks work and what the syntax is. But you don't have to have these no-op equivalents in here. You can do other stuff too. For example, let's say when you read the name, we want to force it to uppercase, force the title case. Then we can write Larry with a lowercase l, and Larry with a lowercase l gets stored. But when we try to read it, our UC first gets stuck in the middle there silently, and we get back the capitalized version. Note here, we're omitting the set hook. That's fine. If you don't specify a hook, you get the normal behavior that we've always seen. But we can now add this logic without an API change. If someone was reading key name and we want to add this logic, great. We've now uppercased the value and they don't have to change their code at all. Probably a better idea to do this kind of normalization on set, to be honest. So, all right, let's store it on set. So we'll say, all right, on write, uppercase the first character and then write it. And then reading is just normal. Again, don't declare a hook if we want the default behavior. And again, nothing has changed in the API. We can also do validation. If we want to say, all right, we need to have a string of at least 3 characters, then write a set hook and say, all right, if it doesn't pass our validation checks, throw an exception. And if it does pass, then we can save the value. This can be done with short syntax or long syntax. It's kind of personal preference and which one's going to look better at the time. So this can block, Al as a name because it's too short. Apologies to anyone named Al in the room. But again, there is no API change here. And that's the advantage. If you want, you can specify a different variable name than value. So if I want to call it new name, we can do that. Cool. I probably won't. There are some people who insist they will always use it. Whatever. Personal preference. I don't care. What is more useful, though, notice we're specifying the type that we want the set hook to receive. That can be wider than the property. So we can now declare a property that is, say, a Unicode string, and then we can set that value to a Unicode string or a string, just a plain string. And then we can handle internally upcasting that string to a Unicode string, which is just an object. And here's an example of doing it with the short syntax. Again, personal preference, really. The value that you set still has to be Unicode string. It has to be the type for the property. But you can have a set that is wider than the property type now. As far as I'm aware, PHP is the first language with this capability. The other languages that have an equivalent of hooks, they usually call them accessors, do not support this. So I think this is cool. But why are we doing all of this? What is the point of all of this functionality? The point of this functionality, as I've hinted at before, is we can now write classes like this and never have to write getFoo and setFoo ever again. We never need to write these empty methods that do nothing useful just in case we might need them. This is a fully capable class that we can extend later if we care. Which means you are going to type the words get and set 90% less. Fun fact, the words get and set are the two most common words in the English language with the most different definitions. Because, of course. And now we can just get rid of most of them because we don't need these get and set methods. In fairness, this is probably a bit more relevant to doctrine than to eloquent, so Symfony rather than Laravel, because eloquence doesn't use properties. Eloquent does not actually let you define your data types, and this is why eloquent is actually a very bad ORM. So this may not actually be all that helpful in eloquent unless Laravel decides to improve the ORM some. That's an aside. Virtual properties. So we have these get and set hooks. What happens if we don't actually use the underlying property? In this case, we've got a full name property. We've got a get hook and we've got a set hook, neither of which actually read or write to this arrow full name. Get is just taking first name and last name and sticking them together, and set is just splitting a value up into a first name and last name and saving those separately. So we can read and write to the full name property just fine, but where does it go? This is called a virtual property. It's a property that doesn't actually have an underlying backing value, which means it's basically a method. This is giving us get full name and set full name, but we can read it as though it were a property. If you have a virtual property and don't specify a hook, then that operation does not exist. This full name here, you cannot write to it. It's a fatal error to write to it. It's a syntax error. But you can read from it, which means anytime that you have a method that is taking no arguments and just telling you something about an object, you can now make that a property. And it can be writable or not, up to you. And a lot of things you can do with it. Things like this where you have a derived property is one of the big ones. But this means that aspects of an object, not properties of an object, but aspects, like, is this thing empty? What is the full name? Is this in a valid state or not? Are no longer coupled to its state. So we have a separation now between thing that I can read as a property of an object and the object's internal state. In the past, those were necessarily the same thing. With 8.4, those are no longer necessarily the same thing. They may be 99% of the time, but they don't have to be. And that lets us do some kind of interesting things. For example, let's say computing our first name is more expensive than just a sprintf call. We can cache it. We have a little look-aside private value called full. And when you try to read full name, we return full, or if it's not specified yet, it's not defined yet, then we compute it, save it, and return it. Who's used this return value question equals something syntax before? I love this. This became possible in, I believe, 7.4. It is so cool. I love it. It lets you do some really compact, really elegant code. Now, one downside of doing caching this way is it's not clearable. So if we update the first name or last name, the full name is now out of sync. But that's okay. We can now add cache clearing. So we add a set hook on first name that will set the first name and then unset that cached value. And same thing on last name. And, oh, look, you can actually do this inside the constructor. That's kind of weird, but yes. Please do not do too much of that. We actually debated a lot whether we should allow that or not. In the end, we decided yes, because we expect a lot of cases are going to use a set hook for additional validation. And for that, making that incompatible with promoted properties is kind of not good. So we're allowing it. Please don't overuse it, but caveat emptor. If we're going to be caching a lot of properties, we can just put them into a side lookup array. The underscore underscore property constant, just like double underscore class, double underscore function, this gives us the name of the property we're in. So on line 5, it's the string full name. So we're caching the result to this cache full name. And then we have clearing logic as well. And note again, all of these different caching mechanisms, the API does not change. It looks like you're just reading and writing a property. The API hasn't changed at all. You can also use it for validation. This is probably one of the most common use cases. In this case, we have a requests object. That's kind of a very simplified version. We have a get, we have a method argument, a URL, and a body. They're all promoted properties. Body is just whatever. Method has a set hook that is going to call a method. Because you're inside the object, you can call methods. So if you're doing logic that is more complex than you want to inline, stick into a method and call it. And in this case, we're accepting lowercase or mixed case and forcing everything to uppercase and ensuring that it's one of our legal values. Should you be using an enum here instead? Maybe, but that's for another time. And then the URL, we're doing the same thing we saw before, where we have a wider set type. So you can pass a URL object or a URL string that right there gets upcast to a URL object. And because these properties are public, you can now update these at any time. And none of these invariants will change. We are still guaranteed that method will be in uppercase and it's one of those 5 values. We can still guarantee that URL is a URL object, even if someone set it with a string. So this gives us the ability to have a very convenient API that's fully self-documenting, transparent, and yet still have this kind of enforcement, still have these safeguards when we need them. Then there's inheritance, because I like OOP, but inheritance from an implementation standpoint really makes things hard. Seriously, a lot of time we spent on the hooks RFC was about making inheritance make sense. But you can do it. If you have a property and a child class, you can override just one of the hooks with custom logic, the same way you would override a method. Works exactly the same. The one difference is if you want to call the parent properties hook or default implementation, you use this kind of weird syntax here, which you can read as call the parent's X properties set method. Follow or set hook. You can only call your own parents. You can't call properties of other hooks. And if there's no actual hook there, that's fine. Just, like in this case, it will still use the default behavior. So we're still going to read and write the X and Y in point. Technically, X in positive point is a virtual property that is using the parent as its stored value. So you're still going to read and write public X, Y properties. Another example, you want to override get. Cool. We've got a class that holds a string because it's boring. And then we have a subclass that lets us fold the string to different cases. And so we call parent get, or parent value get. You technically don't have to call the parent. You probably should. It's the same way you should usually call a parent method you're overriding, but you don't actually have to. That's not enforced. It's just usually what you want to do. Of course, if hooks can be overridden, then we probably want a way to make them not overridden. So you can set hooks as final. See here on line 3, we're setting this set hook to be final, which means we can override the get hook on this property, but not the set hook. So we don't allow people to change, or child classes to change our validation rules. And if you can set a get hook final and a set hook final, you might as well set the property final. So we can now declare properties to be final too, which means they cannot be extended and overridden, which means you can't add hooks to them, and you can't widen their accessibility. Normally, a property you can redeclare and change it from private to protected or protected to public. If it's final, you can't do that. So you can really lock down your properties now. Where is this useful? This is an example that I wanted to be able to do for a long time. Let's say we have a basic database entity that we're storing. It's a product, it has a SKU, it has a name, it has a color. All right. We can read and write to the name and color. We cannot update the SKU. And we don't have 40 lines of get and set methods that don't do anything. We don't care. If we wanted to, we could add those, but we don't need to. But now, our ORM can auto-generate a child class that acts as a proxy that will, say, track when we change a property. This is as a modified array internally. So it's keeping track of which properties have been modified. We have a virtual property that lets us know if there are changes or not. And then on each property, we add a set hook that just records, hey, this has been changed, and then calls the parent with the automatic or the default behavior. And then we have a method to actually get at the modifications array. As I said, usually you're not going to write this yourself. This will be auto-generated by your ORM, but it's fully transparent. So you can still operate with this object exactly as you could with product. You don't have to think about any of this. You can still type it as product because let's go off substitution principle. You can get an ORM product proxy and it will still work. Which means that your repository code can have a load routine. You're going to load your data and then return an ORM proxy product, or product proxy. Populated however you're going to do so. Users can then read and write to the properties. They don't have to look at any of that code. All they have to see is the properties themselves in that little 4-line class. And then when we go to save it, we can compute it on the fly. And actually this here should be the proxy product. I should update that. But we can check, are there any changes? That's a virtual property that gets computed for us when necessary. If there are changes, we can get a list. These are the fields that changed. And then we can write a more optimized query for that, or make an event source event that we save, or whatever logic you want to do. And then all of that is completely transparent to the user. They're just doing load and save. They think they've got a product object. And they do, because it's a child class with extra logic in it. And that's fantastic. And you can do more than just change tracking. You can do lazy loading here. You can have this generated code that will lazily load sub-objects from the database when necessary. How do you want to do that? Up to you. You can inject that code in however you want. And again, it is completely transparent to the user. There is no API change to add it. Of course, there are some limitations. Hooks cannot do everything. For example, they are not compatible with read-only. You cannot have hooks on a read-only property yet. There's some implementation difficulties around that. That meant we didn't implement that. We think we can resolve it. We have a rough idea of how we can make that work in certain cases, not others. We think we can get that in before 8.4 ships, but I'm not going to promise it. Basically, the problem with read-only is what does it mean for a property to be initialized or not initialized when it doesn't have a stored value? What does that when it's a virtual property? What does that actually mean? We don't know, so we can't define it. But that's okay. Read-only is actually hopefully on its way out. The other issue is references. If you've not worked with references in PHP, you're lucky. References, from an implementation standpoint, are the devil. They make everything more complicated. In particular, references just don't work with set hooks. If we try to access a property by reference, then we can update that property without calling the set hook because we have a reference directly to the underlying data store. So you can't do that. Line 14 here, we have made illegal because otherwise anyone could bypass a set hook anytime they wanted to, and that's just no good. But there are cases where you might want to allow a reference, especially if you have a property that was allowed to have references before it had hooks, and now it has hooks, so it can't. So if you want, you can stick an ampersand on a get and allow it to be returned by reference. There's no set hook to skip, so this is allowed. References are also okay on virtual properties, even if there's a set hook, really because that's what happens with __set and __get. So we just copy that same logic. This means if you have a virtual property and you allow it to be returned by reference, understand its set hook will not get called. If you do this, you know what you're doing. So you're walking into it with open eyes. Rarely will this be an issue. The real issue is on arrays. Because an array, if you want to write to it, like on line 17 here, that is technically a reference. There's no visible reference that you see, but there is still a reference used in order to get the reference and then operate on it to update it to add a new value to it. So line 17 we can't actually support. 20 is okay. You can overwrite the entire array, and it will go through the set hook, which will do whatever validation you want on the entire array. But you can't individually update the keys in an array. So double brackets doesn't work. Reading from it is okay, but not writing to it. If you want to modify an array and you want any control whatsoever over the set behavior, use a method. That's the main thing where hooks just are not going to help you because of this problem. So yeah, hooks, they're kind of cool. People think these are cool? Does it sound like a fun new tool, fun new toys? Nods, thumbs up, something? Okay. One more thing though. It'd be really helpful if we could declare properties on interfaces too, to specify that you need to have a hook. You can now. PHP 8.4 includes interface properties. Interfaces can now require properties, and you can specify whether they need to be readable, writable, or both. And you can satisfy that requirement in a class in any number of ways, all of them valid. So in this case, we're just saying there has to be a first name and last name property that we can read from. We don't actually require that they can be written to. This is the equivalent of saying you must have a get first name and get last name method, but it's just now right on the property. Let's look at a larger example. We have a named interface that has a first name and last name, which require both get and set. We're not providing a body for them. We're just putting a semicolon at the end and saying there has to be a get operation and a set operation. And a full name property, which only needs a get operation. We could write a set operation if you want, but we don't have to. To then implement it, we could just make it a property, like on line 10, and you can read to that, you can write from that. Cool, we're done. You can make it a virtual property, in which case for last name, where we're going to implement both get and set because both get and set are required. Cool, you can do that if that makes sense for you. Full name is just a get, so we're just going to make that a virtual property with no setter. You can't write to it, but you can read from it. And again, if you wanted to put a set hook on that, nothing stops you. If you wanted to make full name a real property rather than a virtual property, you could, if that made sense in your use case. Quite frankly, I think you're going to use interface properties more often than hooks. And I'm okay with that. I think that's actually fantastic. Especially if we can squeeze asymmetric visibility in before release 2. But that's an RFC that is still pending and in discussion and may or may not pass, fingers crossed, but we'll see what happens. So that's the latest cutting edge from PHP internals and what's coming in PHP 8.4. Again, my name's Larry Garfield. Stalk me online. Happy to answer questions for as long as you got them about hooks or anything else. Thank you very much.
So you're co-author of an RFC that was accepted and it's going to be implemented in 8.4. That's coming out in November. Is that right?
Correct.
The other person who is involved with this is
Ilya Tovalo.
Right, and he works for the foundation.
Correct. So if you are financially supporting the PHP Foundation, you helped pay for this feature's existence. Congratulations and thank you. So a bit about that. Ilya and I have worked together on a number of RFCs. The previous one we worked on that passed was enumerations. I do not write C code. I have tried to work on the PHP engine and failed miserably. The PHP engine is an actual nightmare of code. But Ilya has figured out how to do it. He's gotten fairly good at it. But he really hates doing the design work and writing English and having the discussions. So he does the implementation, I do the design. Actually, we collaborate on the design. And then I do most of the discussion on the mailing list. So it works out as a partnership. As I said, he is paid by the foundation to work on PHP. He does a lot more than just RFCs with me, of course. But RFCs with me are one of the things he does. I am not paid by the foundation. I do this all in either spare time or time when my employer is not looking. They know that I do that. It's okay. So
that's tremendous because it's a lot of work. Dedication
yes.
Through the finish line.
Yes. So actually, the patch itself has not gotten committed yet. There's like 1 or 2 bugs that Ilya is still fixing up, but it should get merged soonish, probably sometime this month. But yeah, if you look at the master branch right now, you won't actually see it this code yet. So it doesn't work yet, but it will very soon. So yeah, if you want to support PHP development, if your company is making money off of PHP, you should also be giving some money to the foundation. They are one of the best things to happen to PHP in many years. We now have 10 people working part or full-time on PHP Core for the first time ever that are getting paid. This is the most number of people we've ever had paid to work on PHP. And there's been a ton of bug fixing, ton of new features that have happened because of that. If you want to support developers who are not working with the foundation, I have a GitHub sponsor page if you're so inclined, or you can buy books, or go to a site like thanks.dev, where you can actually donate to the dependencies of a project you specify, which I think is a kind of cool approach. So it'll analyze your composer file for your project and say, oh, these libraries are something you're using 3 layers deep, so they will get a cut, even though you don't even know they're there. So that's my commercial for help fund PHP development through either donating to the foundation, supporting the individual developers, or through thanks.dev. And that's a bit of a tangent, but I think gives you some context.
Hey there, this is Luke here. Thanks for that plug. We are not currently donating, and now I'm adequately shamed. So we will.
Speak a little louder. I can't quite hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
It's kind of echoey, but yeah.
You know what it is?
I think this is only through here.
I think I'm hearing it from the speaker. After
Okay,
it gets
how about this?
connected, So
Is this better? Can you hear me now?
yeah, now I can hear you through the actual mic.
Okay, I guess that works. Cool. I was just saying that you've adequately shamed me into. Seven Shifts will make a point of donating to the foundation because we definitely appreciate all the hard work. Loved your talk. I was curious regarding the hooks, whether you considered like a validation hook rather than like you called out kind of the tension between do you validate in the set or the get, in theory, maybe in the constructor. Why not have a validate hook and then just
So we originally did. So I said the version we ended up with is very close to Kotlin. Originally, we started modeling on Swift, and Swift has 4 hooks. It has a get hook, a set hook, both of which, if you use them, means you have a virtual property, always. And then it also has a before set and a was set, or something like that. I forget their names, but those intercept before and after the set, the write of the set happens, and you can use those, those for validation and for tracking. And our original version of this RFC a year and a half ago now, this has been in the works for a long time, use that model. And we ran it by the some of the foundation's stakeholders and other developers and so on. And they said, we like the idea, but this is just so complicated. And is there a way to simplify it? And we thought and realized the reason we have these separate hooks for before and after set is so that we don't have to make everything a virtual hook, or a virtual property. But wait, we can? Could we actually just use right to the property within the hook itself? Oh, we can. Cool, let's just do that. So it was largely a simplification to make the code simpler and easier to understand. That said, I personally have plans for other ways to do validation on properties that I don't want to get into too much here because I still haven't run them by Ilya. But if those happen, you may not even need most set hooks. As I said, the benefit of hooks is that you don't need to use them. And that's where we're headed.
Thanks, Larry. That's great. Now we know we have to come up to ask questions. So, sorry.
Or if you talk really loudly into the microphone, maybe the speaker will be loud enough I can hear it.
It's actually kind of cool walking up to the thing.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Hold on down. I've got a question.
That's what it is.
So Larry, is there any special way you're supposed to test the hooks now?
Read and write to the property.
Okay, so there's no special protocol that you're counseling or anything?
No. What kind of special approach would there be?
I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
No, it's if you want to make sure that it's working, then create a person object and try to write a 1-character string to the first name field and make sure it throws an exception. You're done. So the exact same way as if you call the set first name method and it has that kind of check in it. It's really no different.
It sounds too easy, right?
That's the sign of a good design.
Yes. All right.
Hey there. So I know you kind of talked a little bit more about the Genesis like a year and a half ago. I'm just more curious about this RFC, like how a year and a half ago was there a lot of red tape working with Ilya or like other people in the core team? Like, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh boy. So
Or if it's too much. Yeah.
the RFC process doesn't have enough red tape. The overview of the process as it currently exists is someone has an idea. You discuss it on the mailing list, and if people don't hate it, or you decide to do it anyway, you ask for access to the PHP wiki. It's wiki.php.net. And then you go and make an RFC page and you write an RFC and then you discuss it on the list. And if you're feeling brave, you then call a vote. And if the vote passes with 2/3 majority or higher, then your RFC is approved and that feature gets merged. There's no actual requirement that you implement it before you call the vote. Almost everyone does. It's smart to do so, but technically it's not required. Who gets the vote? There's about 1,500 people who have voting access and about 30 that actually vote. And how one gets voting access is kind of a mystery with no standard around it whatsoever. Every time we've suggested changing it, people have appeared out of the woodwork to object to losing their vote that they aren't using. This also means the only place you get any concrete feedback is the actual vote itself. So you can put in 2 years worth of work on an RFC, not be able to tell if it's going to pass or not from the discussion until it actually gets to a vote at the last second. This is terrible. The PHP RFC process is an absolute train wreck. I like PHP, but the RFC process, the governance for PHP internals, is an absolute train wreck. Ilya and I and a couple of others are talking about ways to possibly try and improve that. Nothing I want to get into in detail here yet, but there's discussion about that behind the scenes, and hopefully sometime late summer, early fall, we can start an actual discussion in public about it. We still have some research to do there. But yeah, it's a mess. So going into the vote, we had no idea if this was going to pass or not. It could have passed unanimously. It could have failed unanimously. It could have been in the middle. We just literally had no idea. We were stressing out about it. It ended up passing 42-2, which I was perfectly happy about, but we could not guess that in advance. And that sucks. And it sucks even more for people who have put in that kind of work and then the RFC doesn't pass. So yeah, it's a mess. It's a huge mess. And the only reason I suffer through it is because I care about PHP. So that's, and it gives me a hobby.
Thank you.
So does that answer your question enough?
Thank you.
Okay.
You don't have to answer this because we are going to publish the recording. But it seems like there's a new dynamic with the foundation and with monies being paid to developers to work on the RFCs. So is this a major thing in the discussions of how to revamp the RFC process?
Oh,
It's okay.
So it's tricky because officially the PHP Foundation and the PHP Project are completely different entities. The PHP Project is governed by the PHP Group, which is a nonprofit that has about 6 members, one of whom is still active in PHP occasionally. Most actual positions of responsibility in the project, like who has server access and stuff like that, are the people with server access give it to someone else because they trust them. The foundation pays people to work on PHP, but they get no special treatment. The fact that Ilya wrote all of this code for hooks on paid time does not officially impact anyone's vote or whether it's going to pass. In fact, last year we had an RFC that was a twin of this one for asymmetric visibility, and it didn't pass. We spent a lot of time on that, and it didn't pass. We're trying again. Now that hooks are in, we think the argument is stronger, so we're working on that again now. But yeah, there's no guarantee that Foundation-sponsored code will get in. Personally, that's one of the reasons why I feel we need to have a better process. So if people are going to spend someone else's money on a feature, then they have a better sense of whether it's going to get accepted or not. Because we want people to keep giving the foundation money. And if they're paying for a lot of time spent on things that don't get accepted, they may not give the foundation money. And that's not good. So one of the advantages I want to have in a revamped RFC process is earlier concrete feedback. So we have a reasonable confidence, hey, this feature, if we can come up with details that work, will end up passing, and find that out earlier. In part for the not wasting foundation money, and in part because as an RFC author, it just really, really sucks to spend a lot of time on something and have it come to nothing. So the earlier we can find out that it's going to come to nothing, the better it is for everyone's just mental health and not abusing our developers, because that's the thing.
That's all, folks.